Good morning, and welcome to everyone, especially those who are in Henry's fan club. If you're in Henry's fan club, make yourself known. Excellent, excellent. At St. Mark's over the summer, we are doing a book group on Tuesday nights on this book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. It's a book on grief and mourning and a new way, a better way of looking at grief. I have had some of the most amazing conversations from some of the participants of this group. People that are, it's not a grief group per se. It's not for people who just have like great griefs in their life. Her book is for anyone who's ever going to ever have to be in a line at a funeral and wondering, what do I say to this person? It's for anyone who's ever been in one of those lines and left going, what did I just say? And yet, all of us carry something. All of us have wounds in our hearts and griefs that we bear, and some are very fresh and very big, and some are old, and we may have even forgotten we even carry them day to day, but we do. And so this group, we're learning about grief, but we're also sharing our experiences, and it has been, I think, from people that have spoken to me, very healing. There's a author and theologian named David Augsburger who says, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. Being heard and being loved are so close that to the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. And that's what we're doing on Tuesday nights, is we're listening, we're hearing, and I think we're experiencing love because we're carrying each other's stuff, which is beautiful. Jesus gives us one of the most comforting verses of the entire New Testament today. Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. There's a comedian, I think it's John Mulaney, that does a bit about living in olden times and waking up in olden times going, oh, it's still olden times. And there's no air conditioning, and there's no phone, and there's no Netflix, and I got these scratchy clothes on. And so 2,000 years ago was still olden times, and people were dealing with all the things they just dealt with in olden times. But in Jesus' land, they were also dealing with being occupied by a foreign power. So they were wearing scratchy clothes, and they were being oppressed by the Romans. When Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, I just feel like everyone in that crowd would have been right there with him, like, yes, that's me. And yet, I think in 2023, if we started like walking down the street and saying this, I feel like we would all be right with these words, because we are all weary and carrying heavy burdens. It's one of these times that I think Jesus speaks to all of us. And he talks about taking on his yoke. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. This isn't a yoke like in an egg that you try not to break when you crack open an egg. This is a yoke that an animal would wear, usually like an ox or something, like a beast of burden. And it would be a big thing that would go around their neck, and then it would connect to the piece of farm equipment behind them, a wagon or a tiller or something like that. And this beast would carry the wagon behind them through the bearing of this yoke. Probably most of us haven't seen a yoke for a long time. right? Most of us aren't farmers these days. But in Jesus' day, people would have seen yokes all the time. I mean, as much as we see cars, they would have seen wagons being pulled by animals that were attached to the wagon by a yoke. It would have been a common thing. In the Old Testament, the yoke is a metaphor. There's this one kind of interesting story where the prophet Jeremiah, God comes to him and says that he is to wear a yoke. And he's to go and take yokes to the king of Judah and the kings of all the nations around Judah, to tell them that they are to be yoked and submit to the king of Babylon. And so he puts on this yoke and he gathers these other yokes and he starts taking them around to the other kings. And then there's this other prophet. He's like a false prophet. He's not really connected into God. And this prophet's like, no, we gotta break yokes. We're not going to be yoked to the king of Babylon. And so he goes up to Jeremiah and he breaks Jeremiah's yoke. And Jeremiah has to go and he's like, God, is that what you say? Are you with this guy? And God's like, no, I told you to put the yoke on. And so Jeremiah goes back to this other prophet and says, you have broken a yoke of wood, but you will wear a yoke of iron. And so there, in that kind of interesting story, a yoke is about submission to another power of authority. There's multiple places in the Old Testament where the laws of the Old Testament, the laws of the Torah, are referred to as a yoke. You yoke yourself to the rules that God has given us. There's still certainly a sense of submission there, but it's like we're yoking ourselves not to an oppressive force, but to something that sets us free and gives us life. We're yoking ourselves to something good. There's several places in the Old Testament where God says, I will break every yoke, in specific reference to slavery and any form of oppression. For people, my people, who wear heavy yokes around their necks, I will break them. There's a tradition in of the ancient rabbis that friendship is like bearing their yoke. It's like helping them. Like when you're friends with somebody, when you're in a relationship with somebody, you help make their burden a little lighter, and they help make your burden a little lighter, which is lovely. So we have all of these different metaphors for yoke. Which one is Jesus talking about here? Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So I find it interesting that Jesus doesn't say, hey, I'll make your yoke lighter. I would almost expect him to be like here, like we all wear yokes, we all have burdens in life. He just said everyone's burdened and weary. But he doesn't say, I'm going to make yours a little lighter. I would expect him to say that. But he says instead, take mine upon you. Now here's the thing. If we take on Jesus' yoke, that means we have to do something with the yoke that's already on us. You can't wear two yokes. You can't be hooked up to two different wagons. It just doesn't work. Yokes are big, heavy, thick things that you can't fit two of them on the neck of an animal. So if we're going to take on Jesus' yoke, what do we have to do with ours?
Give it to him.
Give it to him. Take it off. Lay it down. I think the word in that sentence that has that we should be focused on is take my yoke upon you. Take off these burdens that you have and put on mine. And if we're wearing Jesus's, we're wearing it with Jesus. And so it's lighter, right? But remember, in the New Testament, it's not just me and Jesus, it's us and Jesus, our Father who art in heaven. So if I'm wearing Jesus' yoke, and you're wearing Jesus' yoke, and you're wearing Jesus' yoke, and Henry is wearing Jesus' yoke, then what's that say about this yoke? There's a lot of us holding this thing up. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. I think what Jesus is talking about here is that it's light because he's carrying it and we are carrying it. Many years ago, before I went to seminary, I worked at a wilderness residential treatment center for troubled boys. We took boys deep into the woods to help them sort of reintegrate with society. And we lived in tents, but they were also sort of cabins. They were kind of big as tents. The frame were made out of logs. And then we tacked up tarps on the logs to give us shelter from the rain. And we lived in them 24/7, 365. And whenever it was time to do a new tent, because the old tents were falling down, we have to go out and we'd cut a tree down. And you'd want to get a tree that was dead, but just dead. You didn't want it like dead and rotting. You wanted something that still had some life in it, so it would stand for a while. And we'd cut this tree down, and we'd cut like a 10 or 12-foot section of this tree, and then we'd have to carry it a quarter mile, half mile back to the camp where we lived. And I remember how heavy these logs were. And I remember like getting down and I couldn't budge it on my own. But then we would all, the other adults, the boys who were there at the camp, we'd all pick this thing up and put it on our shoulders. And while I couldn't budge it an inch, we all could carry it a quarter mile back to camp because we bore it together. Our Christian faith is about bearing life with Jesus and together. It's about being there for each other. It's about sitting down and listening to what another person is going through, whether it's something great or something terrible, and knowing that it's okay for us to have something going on that's terrible. I love the epistle lesson that Peter read a while ago. It's one of my favorite sections of Paul because Paul is so human in it. It's in the middle of the book of Romans, which is this thick, heavy theological treatise. If you ever tried reading Romans, it's really hard. You got to like reread sentences over and over again. And almost right in the middle of it, he comes up and says, there's the thing I want to do, and I don't do that. And then there's the thing that I definitely don't want to do, and I end up doing that. Does anyone else relate? Does anyone else walk in being like, I'm having a salad. Definitely having a salad. And then, Boyd, what do you order? You get the Reuben instead, right? Do you want fries with that? Yes, I want fries with that. And then you're like, I'm definitely not getting dessert. No way I'm getting dessert. And then you get ice cream or the cheesecake. I'm going for the cheesecake, right? Those are sort of funny examples, but there are heavier examples of doing the thing that you don't want to do and vice versa. And Paul saying it, Saint Paul being like, even I do the thing I don't want to do, tells us that like he's normal and so are we. There should be no place in our life that we have to go and like hide and put on a good front, but definitely not in church. This needs to be the place where someone says, hey, how are you? We don't have to fake it and say, hey, great, couldn't be better. If I was any better, I couldn't stand myself. You don't have to say, maybe you are. Maybe things are going great. But if you're not, church is the place where you're able to say, it's been a rough week. And church needs to be the place where you are heard. Because being loved and being heard are so close that they are almost indistinguishable. We are about to baptize Henry into the faith, baptize him into the death, and resurrection of Jesus and into this grand family that Jesus has here in Basking Ridge, but also across the earth. And we're baptizing him into this family where we're going to be there for him on his best days, on the days when he has something to celebrate, right? He hits the home run. He gets the AAA plus, whatever it is. We're going to cheer for him. And when he says, you know what? It's been a tough week. We're going to be there for him too. He will bear the same yoke that we do. And because we all bear it together with Jesus, it'll be light, and we will find rest for our souls. Amen.